Hello, my name is David Lee Summers, and I thought today I would read to you from my novella, Revolution of Air and Rust. It's in the series, The Empires of Steam and Rust, which was created by Robert E. Vardaman. And it imagines a world where Queen Victoria is still on the throne and getting younger. Teddy Roosevelt is still president of the United States and building an empire of his own. Meanwhile, over in Japan, the Meiji Restoration failed, and there are still samurai. The Russian Revolution also failed, and the Tsar is still in power. My story is Pancho Villa's story, and we find when I begin the chapter I'm going to read that Pancho Villa is making a desperate raid against the city of Chihuahua. Very desperate because, of course, this is also the headquarters of General John J. Pershing, but Villa thinks that Pershing's forces are scattered around the mountains looking for him. He really doesn't expect to meet much resistance. So with that, we'll read Chapter 3 of Revolution of Air and Rust. It took a week for Pancho Villa's men to wound their way through the arroyos and skirt back roads to a makeshift camp in the foothills across the Sacramento River from Ciudad Chihuahua. General John J. Pershing and his officers occupied a neighborhood adjoining the small mountain called Cerro del Coronel. Hastily constructed wooden structures dotted the bare land around the mountain. Some were barracks for enlisted men. Some were garages for the trucks used by Pershing's cavalry. Some held the munitions and supplies Villa hoped to capture, while Pershing's men patrolled the roads out of Madera. Atop the mountain were mooring towers for the American airships. Just a few guards patrolled the encampment's perimeter. It was perfect. Villa's cavalry could charge in, get the equipment and supplies they needed, and ride out again before General Pershing could summon his forces back from Cuauhtémoc. Sitting in his tent, Villa looked at his pocket watch by the light of a lantern. It was 9 p.m. If his sources were correct, General Pershing, along with most of the men who remained at the encampment, would be bedding down soon. Only the perimeter guards would remain. What's more, the moon would be rising soon, affording his men enough light to see their targets. It was time to get the men to their horses. Villa summoned Rodolfo Fierro, who passed word to the officers, letting them know it was time to assemble the troops. Meanwhile, Villa donned 2 bandoliers of ammunition, along with a pith helmet that he secured with a leather strap. Within the hour, horsemen formed up ranks and began riding toward Pershing's encampment. The moon rose as Pancho Villa spurred his horse into the Sacramento River. Once the entire force had crossed, the officers sent men to their assigned positions and pointed out their targets. Pancho Villa unsheathed his machete and held it high. Viva la Revolucion! With that, the cavalrymen charged toward their targets. Shots rang out as mounted marksmen and perimeter guards exchanged fire. As the horses surged forward, a row of electric lights flared to life ahead and to the left. A half-dozen Ford flatbed trucks had been tucked out of sight among the buildings of Chihuahua. They crossed the path of the cavalry charge. Villa realized all too late what the trucks were doing. He watched helpless as the first line of mounted men rushed into rolls of barbed wire laid down by men riding on the truck beds. The horses tumbled and fell, spilling their riders. A moment later, he fell over his horse's head and felt a numbing pain in his face and tasted dirt and blood in his mouth. Painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. Around him was a cacophony of braying. Confused horses with broken and cut limbs tried to free themselves of the barbed wire. The men fared little better. Some lay on the ground, howling at the pain of broken limbs. Some were still, either from split skulls or broken necks. A few others pushed themselves to their feet. Villa swore. This was a trick opposing generals had used on him before, but it was the first time the barbed wire had been deployed at the last minute by trucks. Still, the men were prepared and carried tools to deal with such a contingency. He spit dirt and a broken tooth from his mouth. "Wire cutters," he called, "and be careful." He took a moment to scan the ground for the machete he lost when he fell. Not seeing it, he pulled his 6-gun and checked that it was loaded. Looking down to the river, he saw Fierro sitting astride his horse, shouting orders to his men. At least they had seen what was happening and stopped in time. The men dismounted and donned tools. Meanwhile, those men with Villa pushed forward through the rows of barbed wire. Villa wondered how Pershing knew about the cavalry charge. It was certainly possible some of his men were spotted as they approached Chihuahua, but the trucks had been lying in wait as though Pershing had guessed details of the attack known only to a few of his most trusted men until the charge commenced. Was there a spy in his ranks? If so, who was it? Villa shook the thoughts aside. He had a battle to win. Even if Pershing had garnered enough information from a spy to know when he planned the attack, there was no way he had time to summon enough men to mount a successful defense. His men breached the second row of barbed wire and rushed ahead to the third. The ranks behind had also succeeded in clearing a path through the wire. Just as Villa began to wonder what had happened to the cavalry trucks, he heard a thrumming sound and his heart sank further. From behind Cerro del Coronel, an airship climbed into the sky. Moonlight glinted from the fabric of the gas bag. An electric light flared to life just forward of the gondola. Shielding his eyes from the bright light, Villa could just make out a pair of electrodes descending from the gondola's keel. Once they were fully deployed, electrical energy arced between the two electrodes and soon whirled into a fierce, glowing sphere of energy. The electrodes flared blue for a moment, and the lightning ball was hurled at a knot of men to Villa's left. The men were vaporized where they stood, leaving only a black scorch mark on the ground and melted barbed wire. Villa turned and ran to his right. He heard the roar of a truck engine. Looking around, he saw a break in the barbed wire cut by his men, and he turned back toward the river. The truck rushed past where he had been standing, forcing many of his men into the barbed wire. He put his hands over his ears to shut out the screams. He didn't know how to help them, and he realized he had lost this battle. His focus changed from salvaging a victory to leading a successful retreat. He looked around and tried to catch the eyes of as many men as possible. Fierro knelt near one of the wire coils, firing at the retreating trucks. Villa waved his arms, signaling for his men to return to the camp across the river. Fierro stood and looked around. Catching sight of Villa, he nodded and began shouting orders to his troops. The thrumming sound grew louder. At first, Villa thought the airship was about to make another pass. Then he looked across the river and saw flames rising from his encampment. A second airship approached from the foothills. Its light swept the battlefield for targets. Villa believed Pershing could have assembled the trucks if he had seen his men gathering in the foothills, but there was no way the American general could have summoned both airships without advanced knowledge of the attack. The only people with that kind of knowledge were a handful of generals who had gathered around a small table in the back of a cantina in Madera a week earlier. Fierro, Robles, Talamantes, who else had been there? He shook his head as he caught sight of a fork-like pair of electrodes hanging from the second airship's gondola. There was no more time to consider spies. He needed to find cover. The light from the airship's spotlight found him. He rushed out of it only to have a second spotlight land on him as well. Both airships were in range. He dove out of the way just as both of them fired lightning balls at him. The two lightning balls collided with an explosion that knocked Via flat on his ass. He looked up, blinking back the spots before his eyes. One large, deep orange spot refused to vanish. Looking away, he saw the night, the barbed wire, trucks driving down the lines between the coils, injured horses, and his men retreating. Looking up into the sky, he saw the airships making long, lazy arcs. Every few seconds, one would hurtle a lightning ball at the ground. The air was filling with dust, smoke, and the smell of charred flesh. The airships would soon be back in position to fire on him again. Turning his gaze forward, the bright orange void was still there. Squinting, he realized he could make out more detail. It was as though he were looking through a tunnel into another place. The ground was orange sand, not unlike the sand he stood on aside from the color. The sky was painted in swaths of blood red and deep purple, like a smoke-laden sunset. There was a mountain not unlike Cerro del Coronel. Beyond it was a city, but the buildings were nothing like those of Chihuahua. Instead of adobe houses and the beautiful cathedral, he saw monolithic structures of brick that reminded him of America's factories in the Northeast. Via looked down and saw that he was bathed in white light again. The airships had completed their arcs and the guns were charging. Without conscious thought, Pancho Villa dove for the tunnel. There was a tremendous sucking sensation, and Villa thought he would be pulled apart. A moment later, he collapsed in a heap on the strange orange soil. There was a bright flash behind him as the lightning balls impacted the ground where he had been. Sand and debris flew over his head, and he scrambled away, then turned and sat up. He found he had a difficult time catching his breath. He looked up into the strange, dark sky, pleased to see no airships pursuing him. With some effort, he rose to his feet and took several halting steps toward the place he had been standing just a moment before. There was no tunnel leading back to the battlefield. So where's Pancho Villa ended up? Find out in Revolution of Air and Rust. If you go to my website, davidleesummers.com, go to the books page, you can learn more about this, and you can learn about the other books in the series, in the Empires of Steam and Rust series. Okay, have a great day. Have a great convention.